That evening at dessert, amid the clinking of spoons and forks and bursts of laughter, my younger sister suddenly dropped a sentence like a cold blade. "I wish you were never born." The whole table burst into laughter, while I sat still, slowly putting my fork down. My heart was pounding, but my lips kept a smile. And then, I said just one sentence. One sentence that made the entire room fall silent. That night, I stood up and walked out of that house to begin the journey of finding myself again. Have you ever lived through a moment when your whole family turned their back on you and you had no choice but to define your own worth? Tell me where and what time you're watching this story, so you'll know you're not alone. Thank you so much. My name is Beatrice Carter, 32 years old, an elementary school teacher. I was born and raised in Springfield, Massachusetts, a small, peaceful town that in my childhood memories was rarely ever peaceful. The white two-story wooden house with the light blue picket fence was where I spent the first 18 years of my life. Whenever I look back, I can clearly see my place in that family picture. A quiet blank space wedged between two colors that were too bright and opposite. Victoria, the dazzling star eldest sister, and Sophie, the pampered youngest, baby. And me, Beatrice, just a faint shadow in the middle, not bright enough to be praised, not troubled enough to be noticed. From my elementary school years, Victoria had already been our parents' pride. She always brought home sheets filled with A's, certificates signed by the principal, and debate trophies with her photo printed in the local paper. I remember vividly the image of my mother standing in the auditorium, clapping until her hands turned red as Victoria walked up to receive her cup, while my father kept boasting, "That's my daughter, future top lawyer of America." Every gaze in the house was fixed on her, while I sat in the back row holding the small bouquet my mother had handed me, wondering if anyone remembered that just the day before I had also won a class reading recital prize. Sophie was a completely different story. She was never as talented as Victoria, nor was she hardworking, yet she was treated like a fragile treasure. Whenever Sophie broke a vase or smeared paint all over the walls, my mother would just smile gently and say, "It's fine, she's still little." My father would shake his head but quietly clean up afterward. Once, when Sophie was called to the office for fighting at school, my mother scolded the teacher for not understanding her creativity and then took Sophie out for ice cream to comfort her. Everything Sophie did was excused, while even my smallest mistakes, forgetting to clear the table or spilling milk, were pointed out. Your big sister is too brilliant, and your little sister is too sensitive. You're the one who has to know how to behave properly. In that picture, I learned to become the easy child. I finished my meals, completed my homework, and never caused trouble. But because I was so good, my parents paid even less attention to me. They always told guests who visited our house, "Beatrice is no problem, she's always fine." The words sounded like praise, but to me they felt like an invisible sentence. I had no right to be weak, no right to make mistakes, because they had already decided I was the one who would take care of myself. Even the teasing from my sisters reflected that position. I remember when I was 11, I used to sleep hugging a brown teddy bear named Charlie. One afternoon after school, I couldn't find Charlie anywhere. Victoria and Sophie whispered to each other and giggled until they finally admitted, "He ran away because you didn't know how to take care of him." I burst into tears, searching everywhere, while my mother, seeing the scene, only shook her head and said, "Just kid stuff. Don't pay attention." A few days later, Charlie reappeared on my bed, dirty and missing one eye. By then, I no longer cried. I simply stayed silent, hugged him tightly, and tried to soothe myself into believing everything was fine. There was another time when both of my sisters conspired to make up a story that I was adopted. Victoria said I didn't look like anyone in the family, and Sophie added that my parents had taken me from some orphanage. I remember believing it so deeply that many nights I lay in bed with my pillow wet from tears, wondering if one day my parents would send me back to the old place. When I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother directly, she burst out laughing. "Goodness, they're just teasing you. There's no such thing." My father patted my head and told me not to think too much. But no one told Victoria and Sophie that their joke had gone too far. No one stood on my side but me. Things didn't get any better in my teenage years. When I cried about being bullied at school, Victoria told me I was too sensitive, and Sophie mocked me, saying, "You're always overreacting." I turned to my parents for protection, but all I got were their shrugs. "Let it go, life's like that, don't pay attention." So I taught myself to hide my sadness, to tell no one. I practiced smiling. I practiced becoming the middle sister who was always ready to listen but never truly heard. Over time, I formed a distorted belief that sank in like roots, that I only had value when I stayed silent, when I did everything to keep others happy. I became the one who cleaned up the battlefield after arguments, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, the one who quietly gathered the pieces no one cared about. I convinced myself that if I didn't, the whole family would fall apart. And I feared that, because for a child, even a cold family still feels like the only place to lean on. So I learned to shrink myself, to become the quiet shadow behind my sisters. When Victoria was celebrated, I smiled. When Sophie was protected, I stayed silent. When I became the punchline of a joke, I forced a laugh. All of it was just to keep the peace in a home that had never truly been peaceful. As I stepped into adulthood, my role in the family seemed to have already been written, as if I could never escape that invisible loop. If in childhood I was the child mocked and labeled as too sensitive, then growing up I became the mediator, the one working quietly in the background to make sure everyone else in the family felt comfortable. I remembered every single birthday, even carefully buying gifts for my parents on behalf of Victoria and Sophie. Once, on the very day my father retired, I scraped together the modest salary of a trainee teacher to buy him a simple Seiko watch. I even called Victoria to remind her to sign the card, and phoned Sophie to remind her to show up at the party. When he opened the box, both my sisters were right there at his side, beaming, posing for photos with him as if they had been the ones who put it all together. I stepped back, holding the camera, smiling, accepting my role as the shadow behind the lens. Every family meal that followed played out like a familiar script. My father sat at the head of the table, nodding along while Victoria spoke about her big lawsuits, her hefty bonuses, or the new car her husband had just ordered. My mother never failed to admire her eldest daughter, her eyes shining with pride as though nothing else in the world could bring her greater joy. Then came Sophie's turn, always eager to go on and on about her next artistic idea. A massive mural, a bizarre photo installation, or a sculpture project that never quite took shape. No matter how many times Sophie failed, the family would applaud and reassure her. One day, she'll find her place. In the rare pauses, I tried to slip in small stories from my own world. I shared that one of my students had just won first place in the statewide writing competition, that this boy had once been painfully insecure, but with the extra hours I spent staying late after school to coach him, he had finally found the courage to submit his essay. I told it with genuine joy, hoping for even a flicker of pride in my parents' eyes. But all I got in return was my mother's distracted nod, a polite, "That's wonderful, dear," before she quickly turned back to Victoria. "So, tell us more, how's the case going next week?" In that moment, I felt like my words were nothing but echoes fading into an empty space, unheard by anyone at the table. Over time, I began to realize I was locked into two roles no one ever openly acknowledged. Both the scapegoat, the one who absorbed the sarcasm and cruel jokes so the others could feel better about themselves, and the peacekeeper, the one who had to clean up and patch things together every time the family fractured. When Victoria and Sophie fought over how to divide the old bedroom, I was the one who stepped in, reminding my eldest sister that the youngest is still immature, and soothing my little sister by saying, "She only wants what's best for you." When my mother was angry at my father for forgetting their wedding anniversary, I was the one who secretly bought her a bouquet on his behalf so she would calm down. Whenever there was chaos in the house, I was there, like an invisible glue holding the fragments together, yet no one ever remembered the effort behind it. The bitter truth was that I had also tricked myself into believing that role was necessary, that without me the whole family would fall apart. I turned myself into the mediator so completely that I no longer knew what my own voice sounded like. I forced a smile at sharp remarks. I bowed my head when my efforts were erased. I was always the last one clearing the table after meals while my sisters leisurely went upstairs or out with friends. I believed that if I stayed quiet, if I didn't complain, I could preserve that fragile peace. But in reality, that peace only existed for them, and I was withering away inside. There was one time, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen after Christmas dinner, when I clearly heard Victoria and Sophie laughing in the living room. They were reminiscing about their old jokes, including the time they pretended I was adopted. I stood behind the door, my hands cold and wet, my heart tightening. I wanted to step out and protest, to shout that their joke had left a deep wound, but in the end, I just kept washing dishes, swallowing my tears. By then I was far too used to being the one who endures, the one who made sure the family never had to face the truth of how cruel they had been to me. Throughout all those years, I slowly came to understand a sad truth. In my parents' eyes, I wasn't a child to be protected or celebrated. I was a quiet cushion, something that existed to absorb their anger and conflicts so they could turn back to loving each other. And because of that role, I was never truly heard. I existed, but I wasn't present. I spoke, but no one listened. I tried, but it was never enough. Looking back, I see now that I spent my entire youth like a sponge, soaking up everything toxic and holding it inside so the family could appear calm on the surface. But I didn't know that one day everything I had swallowed would gather into a violent wave, and it would break at that very same family table, the moment Sophie said, "I wish you were never born." All one. I still remember that evening clearly, when everything seemed like just another ordinary family dinner in the Boston suburbs. It was late autumn and the air was cool, the maple trees outside burning red along a quiet street with hardly anyone passing by. I drove my old car to the house where I had grown up. It looked exactly the same as when I was a child. A tidy front yard, the bougainvillea heavy with purple blossoms, and the porch light glowing faintly yellow as if beckoning me inside. Yet my footsteps on the brick walkway felt heavy, as though some instinct was warning me that something was about to happen. That dinner was meant to celebrate Victoria's latest triumph. My older sister, 35, an ambitious litigator, had just officially become a partner at a major law firm in downtown Boston. My mother, Margaret, had laid out the dining table with a cream-colored cloth and the fine china saved for special occasions. The smell of lasagna she had baked filled the kitchen, blending with the aroma of red wine my father, Thomas, had already uncorked from the small cellar in the basement. My father, as always, spoke little, sitting at the head of the table with gentle eyes that carefully avoided any tense conversations. Victoria arrived like the star of the family, wearing a perfectly fitted business dress, her hair neatly curled, a luxurious watch gleaming on her wrist, a gift from her husband, Robert, a doctor. She talked about her high-profile case and the invitations she had received to speak at prestigious law schools. Her children, Emma and Jack, sat politely in their chairs, living proof of the perfect family my parents had always dreamed of. At the other end of the table sat Sophie, the youngest at 27, with her usual air of defiance. Her hair was dyed blue, her clothes were messy, and her stories circled endlessly around art projects that never reached completion. Despite her constant failures, Sophie was still coddled like a child who would never grow up, defended by my mother with the same refrain. "She's just finding her own path." And me, as always, I sat quietly, trying to blend into their conversations. I shared a little about my student, the boy who had won a writing award after months of guidance from me. The table nodded absent-mindedly, then immediately shifted back to discussing the new BMW Victoria was considering buying. I was so used to it by then that it no longer stung sharply, only a dull numbness crept across my chest. Then came dessert, and my mother carried out her signature chocolate cake, the one she had always been proud of. She set it neatly in the center of the table, the glossy frosting gleaming under the warm yellow light, making the whole room seem cozier. That sweet smell should have evoked tender childhood memories, but for me it only stirred up old wounds. As my mother sliced the cake, placing each piece on fine china and passing it around, the atmosphere shifted into the familiar climax of these dinners. The family reminiscing about the past, laughing loudly as if the old teasing had always been funny memories. Victoria began with a story about her high school debate competition, and everyone applauded proudly. Sophie chimed in with her shrill voice, recounting the legendary pranks hiding my stuffed animal, convincing me I was adopted. Laughter rippled around the table from my father, my mother, even Victoria, as if none of it had ever mattered. Then Sophie, with a half-eaten slice of cake on her fork, lifted her head and locked eyes with me, her expression glowing like someone who had just found the cruelest punchline. She giggled and delivered the line, cold as ice, "I wish you were never born." Her words echoed, and within a heartbeat, the entire table burst into laughter. Victoria doubled over. My mother was laughing so hard she leaned sideways. My father shook his head but still had a smile pressed to his lips. The sound thundered through the small room, reverberating in every corner, while I sat there, my hand trembling around my fork. I could feel my heart beating so hard it was as though it could be heard without a stethoscope. But instead of crying, running away, or silently enduring like the child I used to be, I took a long, steady breath. I slowly placed my fork down on the plate, the metallic chime against porcelain ringing out sharply, making the laughter around me falter for a moment. I lifted my head, forcing a smile not because I found it funny, but because I was too tired to keep pretending. My voice came out low but clear, slicing through the leftover noise. "That feeling, Sophie, it's mutual. The only difference is, I actually have the power to make that wish come true, starting tonight." The room froze. Laughter cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. Victoria stared at me, her mouth still open but no sound coming out. My mother's hand rested on her napkin, her eyes wide, while my father sat in stunned silence. Sophie, the one who had just delivered the cruelest words, now looked as though she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. In the wide room, the only sound left was the steady, cold ticking of the clock on the wall. My hands still trembled, my heart still pounded, but strangely, something was growing inside my chest. Freedom. I rose slowly, pushing my chair back, the scrape of wood against the floor echoing in the silence. I carefully folded my napkin and placed it neatly beside the half-eaten slice of cake. No one said a word. I looked at my mother and simply said, "Thank you for dinner, Mom." My voice was calm, so calm it surprised even me. Slinging my bag over my shoulder, I walked toward the door in measured steps. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of a chair, maybe my father standing, and then someone calling my name, but I didn't turn back. My hand gripped the doorknob. In that moment, I could feel two forces tearing at me. On one side, the familiar fear of being branded a traitor, fear of losing the only anchor I had even though it had rotted long ago. On the other, a flicker of new light, a release I had never tasted before. As the door swung open, the freezing night air rushed in, whipping my hair around my face. I stepped over the threshold, hearing the wind whistle through the yard and the door click shut behind me. On the drive back to my small apartment, I didn't turn on the radio and I didn't cry. I simply let the silence surround me, a silence completely different from the kind that used to wrap around me at the dinner table while I sat feeling alone. For the first time in my life, I had drawn a boundary, dared to speak a sentence that left the entire room frozen. And in that very moment, I knew everything would never be the same again. I was trembling, yet my chest felt strangely light. I had stepped out of my old role, the sponge who absorbed all the poison. I had put down my fork, and with it, the years of being disregarded. That night I knew with certainty that I had just begun a new journey. A journey where, for the first time, I would no longer be the one keeping the house steady for others, but the one building a life of my own. And it all started with a short sentence, right there at dessert. By the time I reached my small apartment on the outskirts of Boston that night, the clock was close to midnight. I took off my coat, tossed my bag onto the sofa, and collapsed into it, feeling as though my whole body had just weathered a storm. In my mind, Sophie's "I wish you were never born" still echoed, and the calm smile I had forced in response felt like a scar etched deep. I made myself a cup of hot tea, but my hands were still shaking and water spilled across the table. I didn't bother wiping it up. I just sat still, watching the thin steam rise into the dim room. Then, almost without thinking, I turned on the desk lamp and opened the journal I always kept on the shelf. On the blank page, I wrote in bold letters, like a declaration. It's time to live a life that doesn't need their permission. I didn't sleep that night. I poured out everything I had been holding back for years. The humiliation of having my efforts dismissed, the bitterness of being made the family joke, and the exhaustion of carrying the role of peacemaker. Each line released a little more tension, but also urged me that if I didn't change, I would remain trapped in that toxic cycle forever. I recalled my reply at the dinner table. I have the power to make that wish come true, starting tonight. At the time, it had been instinct, but now, thinking back, I understood I had to turn it into action. If they wished I had never existed, then I would disappear from their lives in every sense of the word. At dawn, I opened my laptop. The glow of the screen burned my eyes, but I kept searching. I typed into the search bar, "School Counselor Jobs, Seattle, Washington." Why Seattle? I wasn't sure, maybe because it was far, on the West Coast, halfway across the country from Boston. Far enough that meeting my family would become nearly impossible. Far enough that I could rebuild everything from scratch. Listings appeared, many public schools in the area looking for counselors. I read each description carefully, saved the ones that fit, and felt my heart start to race for the first time in years. I sensed a spark of hope for a different life. I sent applications that very day, submitting my resume to 3 schools in Seattle and 1 in Tacoma. Each time I hit apply, it felt like releasing a piece of fear and replacing it with determination. But I also knew that just applying wasn't enough. If I truly wanted to disappear from the old cycle, I needed a concrete plan to sever every tie. I wrote out a to-do list. First, change my phone number. For years, my mother and sisters had been able to call whenever they wanted to ask for favors or unload their problems. If I wanted boundaries, that line had to end. Next, delete my Facebook account. I didn't want them watching me or pulling me back with guilt-laden messages. I planned to redirect all my mail to a P.O. box near the school. That way I could keep my privacy and prevent them from knowing my real address. I even thought ahead to when I got a new job hiring a full-service moving company, flying straight to Seattle and leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment. Each item on the list was a concrete step, filling me with both fear and excitement. I knew I would face a barrage of calls, accusing messages, even tearful pleas when my family realized I was truly disappearing. But I told myself, if they once wished I had never been born, then this was their chance to live in a reality without me. This wasn't revenge. It was the only way I knew to protect myself. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the unfinished list, and whispered like a vow. If they want a world without Beatrice, then I'll give them that experience. And this time, I'll live for myself. The fear was still there, fear of being cast out, fear of emptiness, but alongside it rose a new kind of pride. I had put my fork down at that dinner table, and now I was putting down my old life to begin another journey. Dawn crept in, the first light of day slipping through the small window. I stood, drew back the curtain, and looked out at the cold, damp Boston sky. In that moment, I knew a new chapter of my life had officially begun, a chapter where, for the first time, I was no longer the sponge keeping peace for others, but myself, a free human being. The day I held my one-way ticket from Boston to Seattle, my hands trembled as if I were gripping something far heavier than paper. I brought only a few suitcases of clothes, a box of books, and some personal items. Everything else I left behind, along with the memories of the old apartment, the dinner table filled with mocking laughter, and the words that had torn my heart. When I boarded the plane, I chose a window seat. The Boeing 737 shuddered softly as it taxied, and as it lifted into the sky, I looked through the glass and watched Boston shrink, fading far below. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I only knew I could not stay another day where I had been. The flight lasted nearly 6 hours. High above the clouds, I tried to read but couldn't focus. I opened my laptop, stared at my resume, then closed it again. I thought about the journal packed in my suitcase, where I had written, "If they wished I had never existed, I will show them the world without me." But now a new thought was slowly taking shape inside me. Maybe I wasn't just running away. Maybe I was traveling toward another version of myself, a Beatrice I had never allowed to exist. When the plane landed in Seattle, the sky was gray and a fine drizzle dotted the windows. The air was damp and cool, completely different from Boston's dry cold. I pulled my suitcase through SeaTac Airport and drew a long breath. This city was entirely unfamiliar, and that was exactly what I wanted. No one here knew me as the invisible middle child. No one here labeled me the scapegoat. I was simply a 32-year-old woman who had just arrived, another new face in a sea of strangers. And in that anonymity, I felt lightness. My apartment in Capitol Hill was small, just one bedroom with a window overlooking deep green trees. In my very first week, I started work at a public school in the Seattle Public Schools District, in the counselor position I had applied for. The school was filled with students from many different backgrounds, each carrying their own story. On my first day, as I stepped into the small office arranged for me, I saw a whiteboard and a few motivational posters for students pinned to the walls. A Latino boy knocked on the door and asked, "Do you have time?" It was such a simple question, yet for me it was the first signal. Here, I was being heard, I was needed. I began holding small group sessions, teaching students how to face stress, guiding them to write down their feelings. It felt almost surreal to see those kids listening so intently, then smiling with relief when I told them, "You're not alone." For the first time in years, I felt my worth wasn't being dismissed. I wasn't a shadow behind someone else's achievements anymore. I was someone who could actually make a difference. Outside of work, I made a promise to open myself to this new city. I joined a hiking group I'd found online. On weekends, we hiked the trails around Mount Rainier, the damp air, the dense green trees, and the scent of the forest washing away the dust of my past. On those trips, I laughed more, not the forced laugh I used to give others, but laughter because my heart genuinely felt lighter. I also signed up for a creative writing class at a small independent bookstore. There, I was encouraged to write about anything. At first, I wrote short fictional stories, but slowly, fragments of my childhood memories and old wounds began to appear on the page. The friends in the class didn't mock or belittle me. They listened, they shared, and sometimes their eyes even glistened when I read a passage aloud. With them, my voice carried weight. Alongside everything else, I began a journey of inner healing. I joined a morning yoga class, where the slow movements and deep breaths helped me settle. I found an Indian American therapist, a gentle woman who explained to me that what I had endured wasn't just jokes, as my family had always said, but a form of prolonged emotional abuse. Together we untangled the knots, naming the pains I had spent years avoiding. After each session, I walked out feeling as though I was reclaiming small pieces of the soul that had been stolen from me. I also started a small blog to share mental health tips for students and teachers. At first, only a few people read it, but gradually I began receiving warm responses. Some parents sent emails thanking me because my posts had helped them understand their children better. Teachers wrote to say they had tried some of the techniques I suggested and had seen their classrooms become calmer. For the first time, my voice didn't disappear into a void, it actually reached people. Those therapy sessions in Seattle felt like stepping into a dark room holding a flashlight, daring for the first time to shine light on the corners I had avoided all my life. My therapist, an Indian American woman named Anika, never pressured me to speak quickly or confront the most painful memories right away. She simply asked patient questions, letting me open each fragment at my own pace. In the beginning, I only talked about everyday matters at school, how tense I felt, how easily I blamed myself. But layer by layer, the shell cracked, and I began admitting deeper truths. That I had grown up in a family where laughter often meant ridicule, where affection always came with comparison, and where I was never recognized as a person with value of my own. Annika called it emotional abuse. She explained that abuse isn't only bruises or blows, but also the repeated mockery, the years of being dismissed, and the burden of carrying an entire family's emotions as a child. I remember the tightness in my chest when she said, "Beatrice, you're not imagining this." It wasn't harmless joking. It was abuse. I sat in silence as tears slid down my face, torn between pain and relief, because finally someone had acknowledged the suffering I had endured alone. She also taught me new terms, words that, once spoken, felt like keys unlocking knots in my chest. Golden child, that was Victoria. From the time she was little, she had been the model, the pride of the family, her flaws overlooked, her achievements magnified. Scapegoat, that was me. At the dinner table, I was the target of cruel jokes. In the family, I was the one responsible for patching everyone else's emotions. And then there was the enabler, my mother, who laughed things off with, "They're just kids," instead of protecting me. Learning these labels didn't change the past, but it showed me there was a structure to it, proof that what happened wasn't my fault. Once I saw it clearly, I found the strength to move forward. I began writing more on my blog, this time not just about stress in school, but about being the middle child in a family with a golden child and a scapegoat. I shared my experiences, never naming names, but being honest about what it felt like to be dismissed and how I was learning to heal. To my surprise, readership grew quickly. Teachers emailed to say they had seen students carrying wounds from home into the classroom. Strangers wrote that they cried reading my post, "The Invisible Child at the Dinner Table," because they saw themselves in it. For the first time, my story wasn't brushed aside, it was heard, shared, and allowed to spread. At the same time, I decided to enroll in an online master's program in educational leadership. At first, I hesitated. Was I good enough? Would anyone respect an ordinary elementary school teacher like me? But then I remembered what my therapist had said. You don't have to live inside the mold they gave you. You have the right to redefine yourself. So I submitted my application. When the acceptance email arrived, I sat still for a long time, tears streaming down my face, because I knew I was stepping into a new chapter. The online classes, the essays on school administration, the discussions with colleagues from across the country opened up a whole new world for me. I realized I wasn't only someone who listened well, I also had the ability to lead, to organize, to inspire. I began to dream of one day becoming an assistant principal, maybe even a principal. So I could build the kind of environment I had once longed for as a child, a place where no one would be dismissed just for being less remarkable. Alongside my career, I also began to discover myself in ways I had never dared before. I found I had a sense of humor, not the self-deprecating kind I used to use to please others, but witty remarks that made friends laugh freely. I discovered I had creativity, shown through the activities I designed at school, the small projects I organized. I felt alive with energy during hiking trips, telling stories along the trail and making the group burst into laughter. I started to see myself clearly. I was never the overly sensitive weak girl my family had labeled me. I was vibrant, funny, creative, and capable of connection and inspiration. Seattle, with its endless drizzle and the boundless green of its forests, became the backdrop for my transformation. Each morning yoga session, each afternoon spent writing for my blog, each hour of online classes, all of it felt like piecing myself back together from fragments. And I suddenly realized I no longer had to be the sponge keeping the family intact. I could simply be myself, strong, creative, full of energy, and my worth no longer depended on whether others recognized it. I still remember clearly the November afternoon when I received an email from Aunt Helen, my mother's younger sister. She lived in the suburbs of Worcester, often visited my parents, and preferred writing long emails instead of calling. Her letter was lengthy, and I read it in silence, each line like a blade reopening the ties I thought I had severed. She wrote that my mother, Margaret, had sunk into a clear state of depression. She no longer had the same passion for her small bakery, often opening late or closing early, sitting absent-mindedly for hours by the window. Neighbors whispered that she frequently asked them, "Have you heard anything from Beatrice?" Aunt Helen said her eyes were hollow, her hair graying so quickly it shocked everyone. My father, Thomas, the man who had spent his whole life avoiding conflict, could no longer maintain his calm facade. Aunt Helen wrote that he sighed often when speaking with neighbors, admitting that he felt he had failed as a father. "I should have protected her, but I stayed silent," he confessed. The man who once knew how to repair every machine at the power plant now had no idea how to mend the fracture in his own family. He was clumsy, off balance, and one neighbor even caught him standing in the doorway of my empty bedroom, as if hoping I might suddenly walk out. And then there were Victoria and Sophie, once a united front against me, now turning on each other. Aunt Helen described a Christmas dinner she had witnessed. Without me there to smooth things over, the two sisters began attacking one another. Victoria sneered at Sophie, saying, "You're 27 and still living off mom and dad," her voice dripping with contempt. Sophie burst into tears, slammed her spoon on the table, and screamed that Victoria was arrogant, self-righteous, always looking down on everyone. The atmosphere spiraled into chaos. My mother sat crying. My father shouted at them to be quiet, but his yelling only made things worse. Without me as the mediator, what had once been a dinner for boasting and showing off turned into a true battlefield. Helen wrote that the following year, at Christmas, the family could barely hold it together at all. My mother started baking pies but abandoned them midway, letting them burn to a crisp in the oven. Victoria arrived with her husband and kids but quickly grew irritated when Sophie once again bragged about another half-finished art project. The children cried, the adults snapped, and in the end, everything dissolved into a heavy silence. "No one could keep it under control," Helen wrote, "and people began to realize you were the one who had held this house together all along." News reached me through other channels as well. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had always been fond of me, sent a handwritten postcard. "Beatrice, your mother asks about you constantly. Your father looks 10 years older. Your sisters can't stop fighting. It seems no one realized your worth until you were gone." I read that postcard over and over, feeling both a sharp ache and a strange sensation. Recognition. The very recognition I had longed for throughout my childhood had arrived, but only once I was no longer there. I won't deny there was a part of me that felt satisfied not because they were suffering, but because the truth had finally been revealed. For years I had been treated as the shadow, the overly sensitive one. Yet it turned out I had been the invisible thread holding them together. While I was there, all their attention was poured into mocking me, which conveniently hid their conflicts with one another. I had been the cushion absorbing every clash. Once that cushion was gone, they were forced to face each other, and the truth was, they couldn't stand one another. Sometimes I asked myself, if they had treated me differently back then, could the family have stayed intact? But then I remembered what Anika told me during one therapy session. "Beatrice, you are not obligated to be the glue holding a cracked wall together. Your responsibility is to live your own life." That sentence helped me let go of the guilt. I hadn't destroyed the family. I had simply stopped playing the role of savior. Every update Aunt Helen sent was like a mirror reflecting my worth. They had once laughed in my face, told me I was weak, too sensitive, but when I was no longer present, that very sensitivity turned out to be what had kept them together. They thought they could thrive without me, but the truth proved otherwise. I watched it all from afar, not intervening, but sensing clearly. For the first time, they were forced to see just how important I had been. And in their unraveling, I found a new affirmation of myself. I met Daniel, the love of my life, on a late autumn afternoon, when yellow leaves were scattering across Seattle's sidewalks. That day I stopped by the Central Library to find a few reference books for my master's thesis. As I struggled among the towering shelves, reaching awkwardly for a Toni Morrison novel on the highest row, a gentle voice came from behind me. "Let me help you." I turned and saw a tall, slender man, calm in demeanor, with warm brown eyes behind black-rimmed glasses. He pulled the book down and handed it to me with a kind smile. That was Daniel, a librarian from California who had recently moved to Seattle, and in that single moment, I felt as though I had stepped into an entirely new chapter. We began with short conversations in the library. Daniel loved literature, especially 20th century American poetry. He often shared little-known poems by Mary Oliver or E. Cummings with me, and I told him about the small blog I was writing. What drew me in wasn't only his knowledge, but the way he listened. He never interrupted, never mocked, never tried to turn my story into a joke the way I'd grown used to in my own family. Instead, he paid full attention, nodded thoughtfully, and asked questions to understand more deeply. I realized this was the first time a man had treated me with complete respect. Our relationship wasn't loud or hurried. It unfolded slowly, like Seattle's drizzle seeping into the earth. We hiked with friends on weekends. I took him to the trails around Mount Rainier, and he introduced me to the majestic Cascades. Along the way, we talked about books that had shaped our youth, about dreams, about old wounds that I could now share without trembling. Daniel wasn't frightened by my stories about my family. Instead, he held my hand and said, "You're not there anymore. Now you get to choose your own family." In the evenings, we experimented with cooking. Daniel was clumsy in the kitchen but eager to learn. He laughed softly as I showed him how to make lasagna and proudly served a slightly burned pizza he called pure California flavor. Those simple meals with their sense, their laughter, and not a single word of mockery became memories I cherished more than any lavish dinner with my old family ever could. We also joined volunteer work, teaching immigrant children English at the community center, organizing book drives for underfunded schools. I realized that when I worked alongside Daniel, I didn't have to prove my worth. We were like two pieces of a puzzle moving in the same direction towards something good, and that gave me a sense of ease I had never known before. 3 years later, Daniel proposed to me on a cloudy afternoon at the Seattle waterfront. No fireworks, no audience, just a simple ring and a whisper. "Will you build a family with me? One where you never have to ask permission to be loved?" I cried, not because I was surprised, but because I knew I had found where I belonged. Our wedding took place in a small garden blooming with lavender, surrounded by friends, colleagues, fellow hikers, and classmates from the creative writing course. Not a single member of my birth family was there. As I walked down the aisle holding Daniel's hand, I thought briefly of my mother, my father, Victoria, and Sophie, the empty chairs they would never fill. But the emptiness was quickly replaced by laughter, applause, and the warmth in the eyes around me. That day I understood, I hadn't lost a family, I was stepping into a new one I had chosen for myself. After the ceremony, friends and colleagues gathered around a small reception table, celebrating us with simple yet heartfelt toasts. There were no comparisons, no condescending looks, no mocking laughter. Only warmth. Sitting among them, I thought to myself, this was what I had longed for all my life, a family where I was loved simply for being me, not for the role I played. I came to understand a profound truth. Real family isn't necessarily the people who share your blood. Real family is made of the people who choose to love you, listen to you, and respect your boundaries. With Daniel and with the friends I met in Seattle, I had finally found that. And in that moment, I realized leaving Boston hadn't just been about running away from the dark, it had been about walking toward the light. I had found a new family, a place where love wasn't a transaction, wasn't a battle, but simply showed up and lifted one another. 7 years after the night I walked out of that house in Boston, a thick cream-colored envelope appeared in the mailbox of the home Daniel and I now shared on the outskirts of Seattle. The moment I saw the familiar slanted handwriting on the envelope, my heart skipped a beat. It was my mother's handwriting, the same script I'd seen hundreds of times on Christmas cards and sticky notes left on the fridge. I held the envelope for a long while, feeling both cold and pierced. A moment of hesitation flickered through me. Should I open it, or leave it sealed and pretend it had never arrived? But then, as if drawn by an unseen hand, I tore it open and pulled out a thick stack of nearly 10 pages, filled on both sides. From the very first lines, I knew this was no ordinary letter. My mother's voice on the page was no longer the casual, avoiding tone I had always known. She began with an admission. "My daughter, I was biased. I let my pride in Victoria and my indulgence of Sophie blind me, and because of that, you were abandoned. I read slowly, my eyes blurring. She wrote about going to therapy for the past 3 years, about being forced to confront her own childhood, where she herself had been the neglected child, and how, without realizing, she had repeated that pattern with me. She confessed to laughing off my pain, to letting my sisters mock me, to treating my sensitivity as a burden instead of a gift. In the following pages, my mother wrote about Victoria and Sophie. Victoria, the one who had always been the star, had once broken down in a family therapy session and admitted she had never realized how her arrogance had crushed me. Sophie, in a conversation with my mother, had confessed that saying, "I wish you were never born," was the cruelest thing she had ever spoken, and that it had haunted her throughout the years I'd been gone. My mother wrote, "We have realized it now, but too late. I understand that what has been lost cannot be regained." The letter ended with a plea that was both sincere and desperate. "I'm not asking you to come back. I only want you to know that you have been, are, and will always be loved. I'm sorry for making you believe the opposite for so long." I set the letter down and sat motionless by the window for hours. Daniel came over, rested his hand on my shoulder, but said nothing. He knew I needed the silence. Inside me, a storm of emotions rose. Pain, regret, but also a kind of affirmation. For 7 years I had wondered, would they ever understand? And now the answer had arrived, though belatedly. I decided to respond, but not in the way they might expect. I took out a sheet of paper and wrote briefly, the opposite of my mother's 10 dense pages. I wrote, "Thank you for acknowledging and naming the mistakes. I forgive you. But forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. I have built a new life, a new family, and I am happy here. I hope you continue therapy and continue to heal. Live the rest of your life, knowing I hold no hatred. But please don't expect things to go back to what they were. Yours, Beatrice." Just a few lines, yet every word I wrote came from the deepest part of my heart. I folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, and sent it off the next morning by mail. As I dropped the envelope into the metal box, a strange sensation washed over me, as if the weight I had carried since childhood slipped off my shoulders. I was no longer the desperate child waiting for recognition. I was no longer the woman who had left in silent bitterness. I was now an adult who knew what she wanted, knew what she deserved, and knew how to set boundaries. That afternoon, I sat in the backyard, watching Daniel play with the little dog we had just adopted. The Seattle breeze carried the scent of rain and lavender, and I smiled with relief. I had forgiven, but I hadn't gone back. I had closed the old chapter not with screams, but with a calm, final sentence, and I knew that was how I had reclaimed my life. By the time I turned 40, my life was nothing like the timid girl who had once sat frozen at a Boston dinner table. Daniel and I had built a home filled with laughter, and our greatest joy arrived when our daughter was born. We named her Hope, not just for her, but as a reminder of the journey I had taken. From the darkness of rejection to the light of a new life. Holding Hope in my arms, looking into her clear eyes, I promised myself, she will never have to doubt her worth, never have to sit at a dinner table feeling invisible. Alongside building my little family, my career blossomed. After years of study and persistence, I was appointed principal of a public high school in Seattle. On the day I officially took the role, I stood on stage in the large auditorium, looking out over hundreds of students and colleagues, and an indescribable wave of emotion rose within me. I thought of the girl I once was, Beatrice in Springfield, sitting quietly in class, always trying her best but never remarkable enough in her family's eyes. Now that girl had grown into a woman leading an entire generation of students. One of the first decisions I made as principal was to establish a scholarship fund for students from difficult backgrounds. I called it the Invisible Child Scholarship. The name surprised some, but to me it held a powerful meaning. I wanted every child who had ever been dismissed, who had ever felt unworthy, to know that someone saw them and believed in them. The scholarship quickly gained wide support. Colleagues, parents, even strangers contributed. Each year, dozens of students received help to continue their education. And each time I signed a scholarship certificate, I smiled to myself and thought, this is how I turn old wounds into something good for the next generation. My family life was simple, but full in a new way. Not full of flashy material things, but full of love. Our dinners were free of mocking laughter, free of harsh comparisons, just the three of us, me, Daniel, and Hope, sitting around a small wooden table. Daniel cooked his favorite pasta, Hope chattered about her preschool day, and I listened with my heart overflowing with peace. I put my fork down, looking at the two people I loved most, and realized that moment meant more than anything I had once craved from my birth family. This time, when my fork touched the plate, my heart didn't race with fear as it once had. It beat with gratitude. Gratitude that I had been brave enough to leave. Gratitude that I hadn't given up. Gratitude that I had finally found my true home. Many nights, after Hope had gone to sleep, I sat on the porch watching Seattle's fine mist fall from the sky and reflected on the long road behind me. I thought of my mother's letter, of her late apology. I thought of Victoria and Sophie, now with families of their own, likely still wrestling with wounds of their own. I felt no hatred anymore. I had forgiven them, but I would not return. I understood now that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. Forgiveness was my release, not an invitation to restore a relationship that had once caused me so much pain. The final message life taught me, the one I hope to pass on to my students, my daughter, and anyone willing to listen, is this. Family doesn't mean blood. Family is made of those who give you safety, who let you breathe freely, knowing you are accepted. I once believed I couldn't exist without my birth family's recognition. But the truth is, I built another family, one I chose, and who chose me in return. And I learned something equally important. Boundaries are strength. In the past, I feared setting boundaries because I thought it was selfish, that I had to sacrifice myself to keep the house at peace. But now I understand boundaries are the shield that protect me, keeping me from being the invisible shadow, from being the sponge that absorbs everyone else's pain. Through boundaries, I discovered my true worth. My story is not one of revenge, but of choice. The choice to step out of the dark, the choice to claim my own voice, the choice to build a new life. If someone is reading these words now, sitting in a room full of laughter but still feeling alone, I want you to know this. You deserve better. You don't have to stay just to hold together people who don't value you. You can walk away, and out there is a world ready to welcome you, where you can be yourself. Just like me, Beatrice Carter, a mother, a wife, a leader, and, above all, a person who has found her own worth. And I will never lose it again. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you, dear friend, in the next story, airing daily here on Familial Stories Exposed.